following program was made possible by a grant from the William Penn Foundation.
The mood was anxious as Ironmaster James Wood called the group to order. To his right sat Isaac Jones, president of the Matson Ford Bridge Company. And then there was James Wells, proprietor of the Ford Hotel and Railroad Depot, and Cadwallader Folk, a farmer, and finally, gristmill operator David Harry. Then all was silent as Isaac Jones began to scribe something on 3 separate slips of paper. 3 names, Riverside, Wooddale, and Conshohocken. For it was the job of these 5 men to select a name and apply for a charter to make their Riverside community a borough. The silence ensued as Jones placed the final slip of paper into his high-rimmed hat. It would be James Wells, hotel owner and one-time sheriff, who would decide. The air thickened as he drew one single slip of paper out from the large black hat and read it out crisp and clear. The name of their borough was to be Conshohocken. And from that single gesture, more than 135 years of history would ensue, a history filled with tales of trials and of tribulations, of courage and of valor, the history of Conshohocken. And this is Conshohocken, the place of the long, fine land, or Pleasant Valley, if you will. In its more than 134 years of history as a borough, Conshohocken has seen its share of war and disease, depression and prosperity, and all in the bounds of this tiny 1 square mile community. I guess if we are properly to begin to tell the tale of history, we must go back to before the American Revolution, back to the 1600s. 1683, in fact, when William Penn first came to what is now Pennsylvania from England and purchased this area and much of its surrounding lands from the Lenape and Wokapani Indians for but a few trinkets. The interesting part of this transaction lay in the Indian belief that Penn was paying only to share, not purchase, this Indian territory. The land remained unsettled until a short time later, when Penn sold 5,400 acres of the land to a group of Quaker Friends from Plymouth, England, for about 10 cents an acre. From that date on, a slow but steady flow of people began to inhabit the small river valley area the Indian inhabitants had called Gwenoshiki-Haki-Ying, the place of the long fine land, or as William Penn translated it, Pleasant Valley. And it was just one such pioneer, David Harry, who came with his family to this land in the year 1770. Local historian, Dr. Joseph Leary.
That was David Harry, born in Wales. In fact, practically all the folks that came around this section were from Wales. And they came here because of religious persecution. They went to William Penn. They said, we'd like to buy land. So he sold them no ground. In 1700, David Harry came over and purchased from the farmer family 1,250 acres on the White Marsh side of the Plymouth and White Marsh Turnpike. That's the original name of Butler Pike, or Fayette Street in Conshohocken, if you want to call it that. His ground was all on the White Marsh side, 1,250 acres from the Schuylkill River out to practically Germantown Pike. Now, when you take into consideration that right now the whole borough of Conshohocken consists of 640 acres. The whole borough. He purchased twice that much ground from the farmer family. It was a lot of ground.
Meanwhile, the rest of the land that would later be Conshohocken belonged to the Schuylkill Navigation Company, and it lay right between the townships of Plymouth and Whitemarsh. Fayette Street today, in fact, marks the old township line. It was not long after the completion of the Plymouth Canal in 1824 that the Canal Company decided to split up and sell much of its land. James Wells of Norristown and one Cadwalder Folk were the principal buyers of the property. Wells began the Ford Hotel and Railroad Depot along the side of the new railroad line, and Folk began a small farm close to the bank of the canal. But it was long before these men had risen to such heights, in the year 1725, that a man named James Wood had...
Wood is considered the father of Conshohocken, and he came with his son, Allen Wood, from Philadelphia, and walked up along the towpath of the canal till they found a site where they could get water power to run their mill. And at Conshohocken, the canal had been built probably, that was in 1832 when they came up along the canal, and the canal had been built 5-10 years before. So they made a contract with the Schuylkill Navigation Company for the use of so much water per year from the canal people. Well, anyhow, James Wood, he was the son of John Wood, who settled in Plymouth Township up along the Narcissa Road, and it was at their home during the Revolution that James Wood, as a boy of 6 years old, sat upon the knee of General George Washington, who was with his troops in Whitemarsh Township after the Battle of Germantown. James Wood's daughter, Mary, he had 20 children by 2 wives. The first one died, and then he married again, of course. Louis Lukens married Mary Wood, and he, with his brother-in-law, Allen Wood, built and ran the Schuylkill Iron Works down along the railroad or the canal, and later became part of the Allen Wood Steel Company.
Besides being the home of these men in the 17 and 1800s, the area also served as a staging ground for the American forces during the Revolution. And as William Collins explains, one such rebel battle here even gave a famous Conshohocken landmark its name.
In May of that same year of 1778, the English, who had taken Philadelphia and were enjoying it very much, were expected to leave there because they couldn't continue a war just staying in the city. So Washington, realizing that, he sent young General Lafayette, who was then 20 years of age, out to Barron Hill in Whitemarsh Township to set up an outpost to keep an eye on the English in Philadelphia and see where they were headed and when. So the English heard that Lafayette was there, and they were quite interested in him. The English thought they had all the roads blocked off, but except one, Barron Hill Road. They didn't know much about that, but Lafayette did, and he started his men down that Barron Hill Road, leaving a few around the old St. Peter's Church there in Barron Hill, and in the cemetery there's 4 or 5 graves of Revolutionary soldiers, plus 3 unmarked graves of Indian scouts. So they got down the Barron Hill Road, and started up what is now Hector Street in Conshohocken. And the English trailed him very closely. They found out that he had left. Down at the Matson's Ford, there were 8 Americans killed by the British as the Americans were crossing the river there.
So Lafayette Street got its name because so many men in Lafayette's regiment died in trying to escape from the British?
Well, I don't know that they named it because they died, but they named it because Lafayette came through.
Interestingly enough, the land remained sparsely populated until the early to mid-1800s, when industry first began to move into the area. It was about this time that the small village that developed first gained its Indian name, Conshohocken.
It got its name from the Lenni Lenape Indians, which called the area Winno Shickihaki Ing, which they meant to be the place of the long, fine land. And through the years, after trying to be pronounced by many different nationalities, it got down to Conshohocken. And then it has been given a similar, not a similar name, but kind of a little chummy name called Pleasant Valley. And it's still used by some of the new people here who are building the lower Fayette Street.
When did this area first begin to be called Conshohocken?
At least 1836, although I've looked that up and they said the word Conshohocken has been found in deeds that William Penn gave to various folks, and there's talk of the Conshohocken Hills. So that actually Conshohocken goes back into the earliest 1700s. But, you know, officially a name on a map, you probably wouldn't find it until 1850.
Conshohocken, tell me please, is it a town or is it a disease?
Town resident, Dorothy M. Staley.
When I went to work, the men in the office used to tease me about.
So did these men make up the poem, and were there those who didn't like the town's name?
Oh, I don't know whether that was, or whether it was just something that some wag made up. The name has always been a very honorable one in that in all the wars that came along, there were men who volunteered and served. And the wood mills, of course, were very prominent. And then I went to visit a friend in London in 1956 maybe, and she told me there was a neighbor of hers who was extremely anxious to meet me because he was a representative for the Firestone or some tire company, and he had never come up against anyone from Lee of Conshohocken.
Besides James Wood's first rolling mill in 1837, other businesses in the area included David Harry's grist mill in the early 1800s and the Matson Ford Bridge Company, established in the 1830s. All of these businesses attracted workers, but the largest rush of people came in 1887 with the establishment of the Lee Surgical Supply Company.
What industries do I remember?
Yeah, can you remember?
Lee Surgical.
And then that later became Lee Tire.
And afterward became Lee Tire. And then the Allenwood Iron and Steel Company. And Ivy Rock. A lot of people went from Conshohocken to Ivy Rock to work, which was part of the wood steel setup. And then the glass works. When I was a small girl, the glass works started.
You asked about other industries, and I think I better tell you about I think it was 1837 that the glass furnace came in, and because there was plenty of iron ore within the area in Plymouth and White Marsh, and it was mined, and it was brought down to the Caldwell furnace. Yeah, there was a reason for Caldwell to come here because at that time or before he came, the wood company had to get their iron pigs or slabs from Reading, and that was quite a distance to bring them. Whereas when Caldwell came right alongside, he had a ready market for his materials. And that was probably the second industry in Conshohocken.
With all the new people attracted to these industries, gradually came all the other services required to serve those people. And gradually, bit by bit, Conshohocken grew. For by the time the Lee Surgical Supply Company was started in 1887, Conshohocken had already celebrated its 37th anniversary.
The corporation papers arrived. They came by train from Philadelphia to Conshohocken over the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown Railroad. And the crowd was expecting it, and so they were gathered about the station. Conductor handed the piece of mail to the postmaster in Conshohocken. I think his name was Nail. And he pulled out the document and handed it to the first Burgess, John Wood, son of James Wood, and people applauded, of course, and James Wood looked very happy indeed to see his son accepting the papers and to know that he too had a part in the incorporation. And he also could look across and see the mill which he had started, another one of his triumphs. So it was a very happy occasion for James Wood and, of course, his son, the first Burgess, John Wood, who afterwards was a representative in Washington.
The first improvement to the new community, which was nicknamed Little Pittsburgh, was the town's post office, which began in 1836, even before the village was a borough. Where was the first post office, and when was that post office founded?
Long before incorporation. Where was it? He said it could have been any crossroads. They made a post office at any place, wherever there'd be a lot of people congregate. You know what I mean?
Right.
They couldn't give us a definite answer on that. The second question is, we had a railroad through here in 1835 now. That had a station, Conshohocken. That's 15 years before incorporation.
Right.
But it was still called Conshohocken. The Washington Steam Hose and Fire Engine Company #1's building on Hector Street, it goes back to 1873. And it's the only firehouse in the country, as far as I know, that is on the National Register of Historic Places.
That was the first firehouse in Conshohocken?
Yes. We will have to assume that there was a fire company at least 3 years before that. I would say 1870, at which time the borough would have been 20 years of age.
How about the first school? When do you think that came about?
The year of incorporation of the borough, 1850. I would say that a school system was started, a public school system was started in the borough, 1850.
Well, I remember where the first school was, only because when I was a child, they was owned or either by the Roman Catholic Church or by someone of their parishioners. And they used to have block parties up there, and it was then a kind of sports center. And the old Reliance football team used to meet there.
How about the first post office? Where was that?
Where was the first post office? I don't know. The first post office that I remember was at 2nd and Fayette Streets on the first floor of the POS of A building.
In 1873, a depression hit the town hard, especially damaging the borough's fledgling industry, the steel business. Though the mills were hit hard, they soon recovered and were on the upward climb by the 1880s, when the Allenwood Steel Company first opened its doors to workers in 1887. The new company attracted even more workers, and by, even more industry was attracted to the borough, which was now being called the Iron Borough. The town's population, in fact, went from 4,500 citizens in 1880 to more than 5,500 by 1890. With all these added people came a problem: transportation.
Where the idea came for trolleys in Conshohocken, I don't know, except that in that era, trolleys became very popular throughout the country, at least in the northern part of the Union, and someone saw the possibilities of a trolley line in Conshohocken to Norristown. So there were a couple of bidders wanted for it, and the names I just forget now. But anyhow, one got the permission from the Borough Council over the other to go ahead, and which they did, of course, and that was about 1894. And the trolleys continued to run until about 1933, 34.
And so their demise was brought about by the buses?
Well, no, the demise wasn't brought about by the buses, but buses became popular, yeah, and I guess more economical, and so they put the buses in, which are still running today.
And you could ride all of that for 5 cents. And the girls who lived next door to us used to take a ride on the trolley on Sunday afternoon, and very often they'd take me with them, and it was 5 cents to ride the trolley all that distance.
As Conshohocken entered the 1900s, it still continued to grow, especially its steel industries, which prospered during World War I. And in 1910, J. Elwood Lee, who had formerly owned his own surgical supply company and lived at this stone home at 8th and Fayette Streets, opened Lee Tire of Conshohocken.
John Elwood Lee was born in Conshohocken, and he graduated from Conshohocken High School. I'll take a guess. I think it was 1857. At that time, he was a member of a Bible class at the Episcopal Church in Conshohocken, where his teacher was Charles Heber Clark, a newspaper man and an editor of the Evening Bulletin in Philadelphia. So John Elwood Lee asked his Bible class teacher to try to help him get a job. So his teacher did, with a firm in Philadelphia which made surgical supplies. And John Elwood Lee stuck to his job very well, and he was a bright fellow, and soon he had developed what was then known as a patented splint, which was used in surgeries. So John Elwood Lee, with $26.85, he started business on his own on the 3rd floor of his family home on 7th Avenue, just east of Harry Street in Conshohocken. And the business boomed and took off immediately and got to be, later on, the J. Elwood Lee Company. In his business, he needed some glass vials to put some of his many drugs and so forth in, and he brought in glass blowers and so forth, and they made them, which started a glass industry in Conshohocken as well. And at that time, the automobile started becoming prolific, and he could see a demand for tires, and so they made a few up at the building on 8th Avenue, maybe a couple a day, but they weren't very successful. And so in about 1909, he decided to build a tire plant, and they went down to Spring Mill to do it, and that opened in about 1910. And along with that, he continued his surgical supplies there.
But to get back, was Conshohocken very industrialized and perhaps very, like, blackened with soot and all from all these factories and everything?
No, not that I can recall.
Conshohocken was...
There was a lot of smoke, but it seemed to get carried off. The only thing I can remember about the smoke was that we'd watch it. If it was downstream, fine, it was going to be a clear day. Upstream wasn't good.
How much is Conshohocken today like it was when you were a child? How's it changed? Has it changed for the better?
It's a different town.
Totally different town?
Totally different.
Before, are you saying that before it had character?
Before it had character, yes.
And so everybody knew everybody. You're saying perhaps some of the personalized, or the personality of the town, I guess, is lost with the years. Is that happen? I guess it's happened.
I guess, yes.
So how would you sum up the Conshohocken today, or how would you sum up the Conshohocken when you were a child and Conshohocken of today?
When I was a child, everybody knew everybody else. Today, some people don't even know who lives next door.
But by the mid-1900s, Conshohocken was no longer a mill town. The steel industry began to die. Allenwood closed in 1977, and the tire industry also began to hurt. Lee Tire sold out to Goodyear in 1966, and Lee of Conshohocken finally closed its doors for good in 1978. With the death of big industry came the rise of Conshohocken as a residential area, and today it remains for the most part a densely populated residential area, with the exception of these 23 acres of urban redevelopment land, which it is hoped will be used to spark new life into Conshohocken as a center for shopping and for trade. But there is still history to be found in this small borough today, for some old streets still bear the names of early settlers and pioneers, such as Washington Street, named after General George Washington, for it was this street, which follows the railroad line, which was originally to be Conshohocken's main street. And then there is Hector Street, named for Edward Hector, a black teamster in the Revolution who died in 1834 at the age of 90, in his cabin on this very lot, where Hector Street joins Fayette. Yes, there are still many more places to explore and sights to be seen in this little pleasant valley that is seen so very much. In the end, the poem that was once used to describe the borough sums up the feeling of this little town best. I've traveled near, I've wandered far, seen specter of the Brocken. Still in my heart, enshrined are you, my native Conshohocken. If you would like to know more about the interesting history of Conshohocken, here are several books that can help. Montgomery County, The Second 100 Years, edited by Jean Barth-Toll and Michael J. Schweger. March to Valley Forge, a bicentennial booklet, published by the Conshohocken Bicentennial Committee. And The History of Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, by Theodore W. Bean, Volumes 1 and 2. For all these books and more, try the public library nearest you.
The following program was made possible by a grant from the William Penn Foundation.
Plymouth Township, Pennsylvania, a hustle and bustle Philadelphia suburb of some 17,000 men, women, and children. A bed and breakfast community, as it were, for those who spend their days at work tackling the tough and bullying world of big business elsewhere. Who would ever believe that so seemingly a humdrum community as this could contain so poignant and interesting a history as that which we are about to explore? It is a history not only of a people, but of a way of life now vanishing. For while come spring's first thaw, the farmer of today, like his counterpart of nearly 2 centuries ago, can still be seen tilling his fields. Even here, technology has now crept into his life and changed it forever. This is the story of progress, of men triumphing over nature, a story of what some call success, but what others call mischance. For what was once considered just some 40-odd years ago to be a township with more workable land than any other in the country is now a township with a population nearly quadrupled in size, and a township striving to overcome the problems of that growth. It has, as it were, seen both the benefits and hazards of growth, and while growth has benefited some, it has caused others to lose sight of just what exactly Plymouth Township was and what it is today when examined amidst the patchwork of our nation's history.
Basically, Plymouth Township has changed quite drastically in the last 20 to 30 years. They basically went from a very rural farm-type community to one that has experienced very rapid growth.
I don't think that the township needs to wait for the Historical Society at halfway through a project to come into the middle of a town meeting and tell them what this, start questioning what's going on in this. I mean, I think it's up to the township to be fully aware of what it has, all of its resources. And I think if it can assess itself of everything, I think, and understand the roads and understand where people want to live, I think then it can have a handle on maybe how they want to develop it and how they want to channel the traffic.
In the next, I would say 3 years, will be a big transitional period for the township because it's going to be an exorbitant amount of pressure by developers and speculators and that sort of thing for a change in zoning in certain areas and a change in the patterns in the township. So that, to sum it up, is that things have gone pretty well so far, and we can see the results of some of that pressure already. But it's going to be quadrupled, and so it's really a transitional period.
Hello, I'm Chip Hurlbert, and when we discuss Plymouth Township, we're not talking about just one community, but rather an amalgamation of several different communities or villages. Plymouth Meeting, Coal Point, Hickorytown, Mogietown, Harmonville, Blackhorse, and Cunnytown. Throughout the years, each of these individual communities has retained a sense of history, an individuality, and a way of life, all their own. First tamed in 1686 by a group of friends, better known as the Quakers, the area as a whole was sold off by its former owner, William Penn, as part of his master plan to develop this and the surrounding regions of Philadelphia. Among the first group of owners and occupiers of the region were Francis Rawle, James Fox, Richard Gove, and John Chelson, all well-to-do immigrants from Plymouth in Devonshire, England. From early records, it appears that these men and the other friends who lived here held early religious meetings at the home of James Fox. But it also appears that after only a few years, life in the wild got the best of them, and they moved back to Philadelphia, abandoning their settlements here forever. When several years later, another group of friends purchased the property of 5,641 acres and attempted settlement here, they obviously fared much better than their predecessors, for they found themselves sufficiently well established here by the year 1691 to attract even the attention of William Penn, who in a letter to an acquaintance in the region said, among other things, "Salute me to the Welsh friends and the Plymouth friends. Indeed, to all of them." As the years passed, more and more settlers were attracted to the region, and the land began to take on the name of the English countryside, namely Plymouth in Devonshire, England, from which the area's early inhabitants had come. By 1701, the area of, quote, Plymouth Township could even be found on land survey maps as a slightly wooded region of some 5,327 acres, a slightly smaller amount than that reported just 11 years before. Meanwhile, the Friends congregation had grown, or rather outgrown, the homes of the prominent members at which they had formerly met. It was soon decided that a new meeting house needed to be constructed, and so, in 1704, a piece of land was purchased and deeded for the meeting house at the corner of what is now Germantown and Butler Pikes. Mr. Jim Dodrell is an architectural historian and a past president of the Plymouth Meeting Historical Society.
There are several different ways that roads developed. One was along property lines, and Butler Pike is one of those roads. Butler Pike used to be the end of Philadelphia. Philadelphia County extended all the way to Butler Pike up until, I guess, the 1790s. So that would be how Butler Pike developed. Germantown Pike was probably an Indian trail of some sort, possibly Chemical Road, the same thing. Trails that followed a certain terrain and also went around natural, like Plymouth Creek, Chemical Road.
I've been told, and this is not a historical documented fact, but that roads lead to mills and meeting houses and to markets. They're the main areas of traveling, main places people had to go. So the fact that the meeting house was built right next to Germantown Pike probably meant that the road was fairly well developed at that point, because there were a lot of people using that, and they were probably going into Philadelphia. Philadelphia being developed in 1683, or started in 1683.
From this point on, the region could only grow, and it did just that, as more and more settlers, most of them Welsh immigrants, arrived in the New World and settled here. While many of these settlers came here to escape the trappings of city life in Europe and to seek religious freedom, there were also other reasons for settling here. For as Plymouth grew, it found itself with a new king, something new to draw the people here. And that king was no longer religion, but limestone. The reason for this was simple. For the seemingly ordinary and hilly 300-foot-high community was, on the contrary, rather unique, in that nearly 2/3 of it lay almost entirely on a bed of pure limestone. Now, lime is used in the mortar between bricks, and while it wasn't the reason the Friends had first settled here, as the years passed and the demand for lime grew, it provided a simple and relatively easy way to make an honest living.
Lime was a pretty common resource back in those days, because they used lime for fertilizer and they used it for building buildings. So it wasn't uncommon for people to have a need for lime. Over a period of time, you sort of lose things that were very common, and that's one of those things that have been lost. As far as Plymouth Meeting, they knew that lime was here when people first settled here. As far as an industry, I think it probably started in the late 1600s. I guess some people say 1685, 1686, somewhere around there. Mainly because it was so prevalent and there were such large outcroppings, and it was easily mined here, and because of its proximity to Philadelphia, they could get it down the Schuylkill or down Germantown Pike. In the 18th century, 1700s, it became a full-fledged industry, and there are several books where people took travels around in those times, and they talk about Plymouth Meeting and burning lime. There were different types of quarries back then, and the old 18th century quarries still exist and are still visible along Chemical Road, because in the 18th century they didn't dig pits into the ground to get the stone out, which is, I guess, what we think of as quarrying. They actually dug into the side of a mountain. So if you go down Chemical Road, you'll see a real flat area, and you'll see a cliff of limestone. And that's actually the old 18th century limestone quarry.
With the added growth and development brought about in the mid-1700s by this rapidly developing industry, came many of the services needed to serve the area's ever-growing population. Among the first of those services were the inns, of which Plymouth had two: the Seven Stars Inn, built in 1754, and the Black Horse Inn, constructed sometime around the 1760s.
And this, behind me today on Ridge Pike, almost to Norristown, is the site of the once grand Black Horse Inn. One-time eatery, rest haven, and general watering hole for the weary traveler. Its grandness today has somehow been lost, for it stands now as only the office for an auto parts store. And yet, despite its haggard appearance, it somehow retains a sense of history, an air of mystique. Perhaps much of this lay in the fact that it was once conqueror of all that is now here, gas station and produce stand alike. For today, it alone remains a solemn reminder of days, lives, and a way of life now past. The Seven Stars Inn, however, has not fared so well. For while cars still pass outside what was once its front door, the passers-by no longer stop as they once did. Where this once great structure stood, now stands the Ridge Pike interchange of the Pennsylvania Mid-County Expressway, or Blue Route.
In addition to these inns, however, recent evidence also suggests that the late 1700s also saw the establishment of a general store, not all that far from the site of the Seven Stars Inn, on what would later be known as Germantown Pike.
First of all, Samuel Livesey was, father purchased the mill down in Spring Mill, and he operated a store. He didn't operate the mill himself, but he operated the store. He bought it in 1780, but because of his health, and I think because of the dust from the mill, it was so bad that his father decided that he ought to move his business somewhere else. So Samuel moved up to Plymouth Meeting and bought a store, which is now what we refer to as the Livesey store. And this was done in 1788.
I don't know whether this was, well, his family apparently was always in this area. And that's probably why he relocated in the area. And for some time they used it, it was like a cider press. And I think probably the idea of the store developed from that to some extent. Secondly, there was some sort of plague in Philadelphia in the late 1700s. And Samuel Livesey offered, all the farmers and people were afraid to go down to Philadelphia, so he offered his services, and that's another reason why the building became sort of, you know, store and that sort of thing.
My sons and I purchased this whole property some 4 or 5 years ago, and this structure, of course, as you may have seen it some years ago, was in pretty bad shape, and they attempted to have it demolished, the previous owners, but the township and the courts refused to let it be torn down. I've been told, and we're still trying to do as much research as we can, that it was possible that some of Washington's troops were housed in the attic section of this middle building, which is quite a large attic section in there. The other thing that I've heard, and it's not documented, that since Livesey was a Quaker and they believe he was involved with the Underground Railroad, that there's a good chance that this building was also used as part of the Underground Railroad, and that some of the blacks that were brought north were housed in the attic of this building. I have no proof of any of that as yet, at least.
Thus, for the most part, the 18th century passed quietly here in Plymouth, and life continued on as it had before, as the dawn of the 19th century drew upon the horizon. The Revolutionary War had come, and it had gone. And while you would think that following that great upheaval of lives, things would have quieted down some,
In reality, quite the opposite occurred. For conflict arose in 1827 within the very party that had shunned all the violence and strife that war had brought about. And that party was the Quakers. The conflict culminated in a portion of the group, calling themselves the Orthodox Congregation, splitting from the original body, and building not long afterwards its own two-story stone meeting house. In the meantime, those who remained as part of the original body, so as not to be outdone, took on the name the Hicksites, and remained where they were. Now all of this might not seem so unusual, save for the fact that, for their own convenience, the site the Orthodox members chose for their new meeting house lay just behind these trees and not more than 200 yards distant to the original structure.
The Hicksites, who followed Elias Hicks, who was a minister from New Jersey, put more emphasis on the inner light, and the Orthodox put more on Bible reading. The Orthodox believed that the Bible should be followed exactly. The Hicksites did not.
And who stayed and who had to move?
The Hicksites stayed here because they were the bigger group. There was something like, I don't know the figures exactly, but there was something like 300 Hicksites and about 45 Orthodox. And they died out pretty quickly after they moved.
The early part of the 1800s also saw the need for a faster and more efficient means of transportation, not only for people, but goods, especially lime. Thus, several railroad lines were established in the region during the first few decades of the 19th century. Some were just additions to existing passenger lines, like the Pennsylvania line, which had a station, Plymouth Station, not all that far from where Samuel Livesey ran the region's first store. Others served as simple freight lines, like the one that George Corson constructed right here in 1836, to ferry lime from his kilns right here in Plymouth Meeting all the way to the Schuylkill River. Now, George Corson's life story is an interesting one. He got into the lime business by way of his father-in-law, Samuel Mosby, an early limestone magnate. You see, it was upon Mosby's death that his son-in-law George inherited the family lime business, which he ran with the help of his brother, Alan. They set their kilns up right here, just down the street from the Quakers' first meeting house. And they ran their railroad line right down there, roughly following this newer freight line towards the river. The Corson kilns are all but gone now, victims of a modern society. This similar kiln on Butler Pike, just up the street from the original structures, is all that remains. And the weather and elements have taken their tolls on it. But recent excavation on another series of kilns along Germantown Pike by Mr. Ken Baslick and a team of archaeologists has uncovered quite a bit about the industry and the lives of those associated with the kilns and with lime production.
Well, this location was brought up by the Plymouth Meeting Historical Society, discovered through historical research. Part of what they found by looking at old maps was there was a series of 5 lime kilns here. A lime kiln is basically an oven, like a pottery kiln would be. And what you were trying to do is you're trying to take limestone and break limestone down into calcium oxide. Calcium oxide is used for spreading on fields to help the fertility. It's used for whitewash, for spreading over houses. It's used in iron making as a flux to help remove certain of the impurities from iron ore, and has minor uses like being mixed with sand and used as mortar. Well, we've found a variety of different things, both artifactual material. We found such things as cut crystal glasses, whiskey flasks, ketchup bottles, toys of different sorts, porcelain figurines, a variety of things like shovels, most of which date to the 1930 period. What we found prior to that is mostly archaeological features. Shallow pits filled with burnt lime, ash, border, and a variety of other architectural type remains. They are building a development just over the hill, which is slated to destroy the front portion of lime kilns along Germantown Pike. As a result, we were digging here to discover what, if anything, still existed from the 19th century lime kilns that might be destroyed by the actions of the industrial campus.
Just as the Revolutionary War changed the shape of America by freeing it from foreign rule, the outbreak of civil war was likewise to bring about similar changes, though it was no longer the colonialists, but the blacks who were fighting for their freedom. And just as a division of public opinion over the matter of slavery was split throughout the nation, it was likewise split here, and thus made for quite a few problems, especially among the Quaker population.
There were a lot of Friends involved with the abolition movement, which was really a very radical movement. And to defy the law was a very difficult thing for a lot of Friends. And to have speakers, radical speakers, okay, come out and speak on a very emotional subject met with a lot of distaste. With George Corson, who felt very strongly about the abolition movement, probably the meeting was not at all willing to entertain speakers, and so he what he did was construct an addition onto his barn, and this, of course, is known as the Abolition Hall today, and there were many famous abolitionists that came out to speak there, and they were attended by Friends and non-Friends alike. But this is the circumstances around why it was not held at the meeting house, but it had to be held at another building close by.
The late 1800s also saw further industrial growth for the region, even among Plymouth's lesser-known industries, such as the quarrying of iron ore. The industry had begun as early as the 1830s, with the first discovery of ore in the region, and had continued on well into the late 19th century, with Allen Wood Steel's continued reliance upon Plymouth's natural resources. In 1893, Plymouth similarly saw the establishment of a standardized trolley service down the old Germantown-Perkiomen Turnpike from Norristown. This line expanded even further in 1895 when a line connected the route to Conshohocken. As a whole, progress had been good in this tiny region. Good, that is, until tragedy struck, right here in 1895, with the death of Tom Hoveden, a nationally famous artist and George Corson's son-in-law. You see, in those days, the trolley service ran right down here, right down the center of Germantown Pike, and it intersected the Pennsylvania Railroad line just behind me. As a result of a dispute between the railroad line and the trolley service, the trolley passengers, upon coming to the intersection of the railroad, had to get off their trolley, walk across the tracks, and resume their trip on the other side. It was on one particularly warm summer day in 1895 that Tom Hoveden caught sight of a young neighbor's child running ahead across the railroad tracks, directly in front of an oncoming freight train. Hoveden rushed to save her, but sadly enough, both were killed. The death of the trolley system occurred just about 35 years later, in the 1930s, with the establishment of standardized bus routes in the region. And yet all that modernization brought about was not so tragic, for the township's farming and dairy business increased with the establishment of railroads to carry the farmers' goods to larger markets. And because of this, a common sight during the late 19th and early 20th centuries were the milk trains that carried not only passengers, but the local farmers' milk to Philadelphia and other communities. And yet, in the end, what really made Plymouth so truly unique wasn't its industry or its development, but rather its people. And a large portion of that individuality was really the result of the separate villages or communities that had sprung up right here in Plymouth during its early years of development. For it were these tiny villages or communities that not only made life what it is here today, but also made life from one end of the township to another so vastly different. Among those early villages were Plymouth Meeting, located right on the border of Plymouth and White Marsh Townships. It was the site of the original Quaker settlement in the township, and in addition, was also the site of the Quakers' first meeting house. Today, though heavily built up, it still retains quite a large number of historically significant structures, several of which are now slated for reconstruction work. Harmonville, south of Plymouth Meeting and located at the corner of Ridge and Butler Pikes. Once the site of farms and pasture land, it was helped along financially by ore and marble quarrying there, and following World War II, it showed a spelling change from Harmonville to Harmonville. Today, the quarries are gone now, as it is now the site of shopping centers and office buildings. Hickorytown, located just west of Plymouth Road and Plymouth Meeting on Germantown Pike, and so named because most of its inhabitants cut hickory wood. It was at one time the site of the Hickorytown Hotel. Now it is the site of gas stations, stores, and the Plymouth Meeting Mall complex. Mogietown, which developed in 1880 as a company town, when William Mogi built 60 tenement houses for workers. It is located on what is today the border of Plymouth Township and Norristown, just off Ridge Pike on Conshohocken State Road. All that remains of the village today is this tiny grouping of two-storied stucco homes. Black Horse, located just before Mogietown on Ridge Pike, was once the site of several homes and the well-known Black Horse Inn. Today, it is the home of numerous small businesses. Cunneytown, which developed quite silently in the southeastern portion of the township, and consists today of these scattered buildings on Caldwell Lane, just off Ridge Pike. In the past, Caldwell Lane served this region with a direct route for trade to Conshohocken. And finally, Coal Point, the tiny grouping of homes on Butler Pike just north of Plymouth Meeting. At one time in danger of being destroyed by the Blue Route, it also includes these homes on Narcissa Road, right behind the Plymouth Meeting Mall, and is probably the best preserved and most intact of Plymouth's original communities.
And yet, while this small village hasn't changed, Plymouth as a whole has. And this change, for the most part, has been the result of time and modernization. For as Plymouth Township entered the 20th century, a gradual